Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Casco Bay Regional Shellfish Working Group meeting. As most of you know, we had planned to meet on March 30th in person in Bath, and because of COVID-19, we had to shift gears to an online meeting via Zoom. We realize this is less than ideal, but we appreciate you taking the time as we do have some interesting presentations and would like to hear from you all on what's happening in your communities. I'm going to spend a few minutes reviewing the purpose and agenda for this meeting, but before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge that we realize the fishing community has been significantly and adversely impacted by this pandemic. And while we understand it's hard for some to participate in something like this webinar that's business as usual, we are going to spend some time hearing from you all on what your needs are and how the working group might support the shellfish community. We are holding this webinar as it's still important to plan for the future management of this resource, even during a crisis when it's hard to focus on anything more than today. On that note, we want to thank all the 9 communities, including the wardens, town clerks, and committee chairs who worked with us to help distribute emergency direct assistance to the shellfish community that was provided by the Broadreach Fund, the Maine Community Foundation. Thanks to all your help, we were able to provide direct assistance to 9 towns participating in the working group, giving out 80 Hannaford gift cards valued at around $3,150. We will also review several federal and state financial resources that are available at the end of the meeting. And I'll provide information on a webinar that's happening tomorrow, hosted by the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association on the Federal CARES Act and state unemployment, with specific focus on the fishing industry and self-employed, as well as contractor, crew, and aquaculture businesses. If you are a harvester who would like to get conservation points, email me with your request and I'll submit that to your warden. And with that, I will just do quick introductions and then move on to the purpose. So I'm Jessica Joyce, one of the coordinators of the working group, and my business is Untitled Bay Consulting, and Ann Hayden is my project partner.
Hi, I'm Ann Hayden. I'm a fisheries program manager with Manomet, a sustainability nonprofit based in Brunswick.
Thanks, Ann. So briefly, for those of you new to the working group, this is based on strength in numbers and that we have really fast changes coming in our climate that are definitely showing up in our intertidal zone. And the purpose of this group is to work collaboratively to address these pressing issues facing our shellfish communities, sharing expertise, best practices for management, conservation, research, and monitoring across towns and stakeholders in Casco Bay. The agenda for today, after we have our welcome, is to hear from all the towns on what you've been seeing and how you're trying to go about your business during these difficult times. We have 4 areas that the working group has focused on that we'll provide updates on. And we also have 2 presentations and some time for discussion, and then we'll end with announcements and next steps. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn it over to Ann. And if you have any other questions about participating, you can chat them in the box. So Ann.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. For those of you who have been to a working group meeting before, we always start with what we call town sharing, and just hearing what's important to towns, about their shellfish industry, what they're working on, and that kind of thing. So we have a couple of questions that we'd like you all to think about, and I will call on towns one by one to facilitate the process, and we'd like you to share what are the most critical needs for your town and for the shellfish community that you're facing currently. And if you have any conservation projects you're working on or research projects, do you have equipment needs that we could help with. That we have an equipment budget that could be shared, a budget for equipment that could be shared with the communities. So let us know whether that makes sense to you as well, or you have an interest in that. All right, so I know from looking at the participant list that we have Harpswell on the line, and Paul, if you have something you'd like to share, I've unmuted you.
So there's nothing really new on our end. I know a lot of the guys are still, the harvesters are still trying to sell through Facebook and meeting with other vendors. You know, things are just really tough right now, and sorry about that. You know, I think everyone's kind of focused on this upweller project that we have up and coming. The town of Harpswell did receive a grant to do this. We're focusing on creating a tidal upweller to raise juvenile quahog seed. We're struggling to get some of the materials because some of our materials are out of state. You know, so trucking is considered essential right now, but it does put a damper on some of the floats that we're looking at getting. And on top of that, the harvesters want to get building. If they can't be working, they want to be building. But unfortunately, the town can't authorize, you know, committees or anything town related to occur. You know, especially during these times. So that's kind of what we're struggling with. We're trying to get all our pieces and all our ducks lined up in a row. And that way, when things hopefully return back to normal in the near future, we can just go to town on this project.
Do you think there's a chance of getting it done this spring, or when would you need it by for it to be useful this year?
So we do have an order in to get 500,000 juvenile quahogs. So we will have this done. One way or another, we're going to have it done. And I'd say by late May, early June, it should be in the water.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Paul. So let's see. I see we have Nate from Scarborough on the list. So I'm going to call on you next.
Let me hold on. I think I can. You guys see me now?
Yep.
Sorry, I got bad service down in the basement. I'm in the spare room. Yeah, so we haven't really been doing much of anything. Our last meeting was canceled because the committee, like only 2 people of the committee could make it, and we're not really doing much of anything. We have a project coming up May 5th to put out deployment boxes with the Down East Institute. Our license lottery was canceled indefinitely, postponed indefinitely, so I'm guessing that's not even going to happen until next year now. And we actually had, I think, 3 resident commercial licenses up, which is the most we've had in a handful of years. But yeah, we're just setting our conservation calendar. A lot of people, you know, there was a lot of ideas going around about what we could do and stuff, and I think those are kind of burned out due to this whole hysteria, you know, for the time being. You know, not really much at all to report on, honestly.
Well, you're not alone.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have anybody from Phippsburg? You're going to have to tell me, put your hand up one way or the other.
Yeah, I don't see anyone, Anne.
Okay. How about Freeport?
I don't see anyone from Freeport. I've been in touch with Charlie Tatro, our warden here, and he has suspended the conservation activities that were planned for now. And the licensing and renewals, I believe, are being taken care of by mail. So I know that some towns have extended their current licensing. I believe that Freeport is still accepting licenses and renewals by mail. And in terms of, I think that those are the only two updates that I have. I'm sure there's others, but.
All right. I see Judy Colby-George from Yarmouth. I don't know if there's anybody else from Yarmouth. Judy, do you have any updates?
Like everybody else, I don't have a lot to update. We did have a meeting last night, although somehow I missed it. But so I think in terms of licenses, we didn't have a quorum. We haven't had a quorum, and we wouldn't have had a quorum, I think, even if I came. I can't remember. We might have. But I missed the invite to the online meeting. So anyway, I think the town, since we just recommend to the town council, I don't know what they're going to do on Thursday. They may just decide to maintain the same license structure as we had last year. Or they may make some changes. I don't know. So I think it's on their docket for Thursday for the council meeting. And other than that, I think everything else that we're doing is kind of on hold like everyone else. I think our surveys are on hold. And we were going to be hiring somebody to do expansive shoreline surveying and water quality testing over the summer. And I think that's on hold also. It's not canceled yet, but it's just on hold.
All right, thank you. It's common up and down the line here. All right, how about Brunswick? Let's see.
Susan is on the phone, I think, Anne.
Who?
Susan Alcott.
Susan, I also see Cody.
Oh, okay, right.
Sorry. There you go, Cody.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. So, I wish there was more to report. For us given everything happening. I know we're currently trying to get our cohort project together. That I know we get funding from Broad Reach. I think the Bowdoin grant. Just trying to get things together for that. Of course, it's difficult now because we can't obviously all be meeting up to construct all this stuff. But I think hopefully, within a month we'll be able to get cracking on that stuff. I know we're having our license lottery next week here in Brunswick. I don't recall how many licenses we're supposed to be, are up for lottery this year. I don't know how many other people are around here from Brunswick or not, but today is or was the deadline to pick up your 2020 Shellfish license, unless you pay an administrative fee. We are doing a little program this year where you can pay for half of it now and then half by June 15th. So hopefully if people are hurting for money, they took advantage of that. Other than that, pretty limited market right now, and people are just trying to scrape up what they can to get by. So tough times for everyone. It really kind of sucks right now, but hopefully come summertime things turn around. I don't know if Susan has anything she'd like to add about.
All right. Thanks,
Cody, and I'm glad you're able to be muted still. Okay.
Susan, you're unmuted. Oh, you were.
Are you doing it, Jessica? I feel like we're doing it at the same time.
Okay. Go ahead, Susan, if you have anything to add.
Okay, yeah, I think you guys were opposing forces. It was you are muted, you are unmuted, you are muted, you are unmuted. Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Cody. And I'm glad that it worked out for you to be able to be on this call too. Just to give, you know, the real perspective. I think the only thing I would add is I know they had planned on going out to put recruitment boxes out in Harpswell Cove and at Thomas Point Beach this past weekend with Sarah Randall from DEI. This was Dan and Dan who were going to do that. And as far as I know, that happened. I was on an organizing call with them a couple weeks ago. And we talked, you know, similarly to every town, we talked about how work would be possible if, you know, or how it might be made possible by having fewer people tend to some of these projects at a time than had originally been planned. We're hopeful that they'll still be able to go forward and the Upweller project will still go forward. And then the other conservation project that is in the works is the shoring up project at Wharton Point, where they'll be putting in some different kinds of berms to hold back erosion. And again, that was another conservation opportunity that is, you know, sort of up in the air right now, how that's going to happen. And it could have involved a whole bunch of people carrying some heavy stuff that can't all work together, at least in the short term. So trying to figure out some mechanics there. Yeah, and then just in terms of marketing, I mean, I know, and Cody can correct me, but I think we at least have a couple dealers in town who are selling now and who are trying to get the word out more to get consumers to come by, since usually their market is restaurants. So that's a positive thing because they weren't both buying, and now cohogs are open for us too. So, and I think Cody filled in on where we are with licensing. And I guess the only other thing is we're doing kind of a relook at all of the town, what am I thinking? The legislation, the codes for our shellfish ordinance, to look at the student license program and some other items. So we've organized a working group to look into that. That's going to be getting going in the next few weeks, and hopefully kind of take advantage of some of this time where we're not able to meet in person to make some progress there. So I think, yeah, that's the only additional stuff I have to add.
All right, thanks, Suzanne. All right. Do we have anybody from Georgetown? All right, hearing none, seeing none. Shabig? Do we have Bob? I think he said he could not participate. All right, let's see him. Cumberland?
I don't see anyone.
No. And West Bath or Rousick? All right. Well, I think that is the wrap on the town sharing, unless there's somebody else who would like to chime in.
Okay.
All right.
All right, so we'll move on to the next part of our agenda, and this is a few updates on the 4 focus areas of the working group. And since we have a few folks who are new for this meeting, our first meeting was in January, and we brainstormed a bunch of ideas on some topics that are more regional of nature that we could address. And the steering committee, who today we have Nate Orff from Scarborough on, and I'm trying to think if we have anyone else from our steering committee, Paul Plummer also from Harpswell, and I know Kevin said he was gonna join, so he might at some point, but narrow these down to 4 areas that we talked about at the March meeting. And these are I'm going to pull them up here on the screen. What we would have done in an in-person meeting is sat down and provided updates and then had everyone work on the next steps for these. But since we're meeting on a webinar, I thought I'd just give quick updates on each of these so we know where things stand, and work on these will be ongoing over the next couple of months. One of the 4 areas is a guidance document on multi-species management, and this is just focusing on the fact that a lot of towns are now managing more than just soft shell clams, and are looking at other conservation and licensing questions around these species. So we have 3 students from Bates here who have been working with us, who are going to present on some case studies that they looked at on how other states manage multiple species, and also a literature review. Ultimately, we'll have that presentation today, and ultimately we'll turn that into a guidance document for the towns just to bring to their shellfish committees and talk about other considerations that they may want to think of. The second one is creating resources to inform town council. This was a comment that came from a few of the meetings that the committees, the Shellfish and Marine Resource Committee, spend a lot of time looking at license allocations and budgeting for the committees, and that there wasn't always a full understanding of the shellfish industry economics or even how the program works as a town council. So an outline, we've drafted an outline to basically prepare a presentation and some handouts that we will share with towns to be able to, with the shellfish committees, to be able to share with their town councils if you would like to, or have one of us help present that as well. So Anne is going to be working with that small group from the January meeting, and once those materials have been drafted, we'll send them out to the full working group in the coming months. The shellfish conservation projects, there's a few of these, and this just came from requests to towns that they're looking for something new to do to gain, to have options more than just surveys or shoreline cleanups, or some of the more recent conservation activities around recruitment boxes and the like. So there was one idea on these floating spat collector bags that came up from a few of the harpswell harvesters at the January meeting. And before the pandemic, we made a lot of progress on these to test these bags and compare them to recruitment boxes in the mud. But these would be floating from a mooring or something similar. We had scientist Marissa McMahon, who's on the line, from Manila. We had interns and even some funding, although given the limited resources and how everyone's kind of struggling just to meet their status quo right now, and we lost our intern, so we're thinking that this will be something that can get off the ground a year from now, next spring. Work is underway for a guidance document around various projects that towns can do on quahog restoration, from growing out the really tiny 1 millimeter seed that you can get from hatcheries in a nursery in bags, or oyster grove bags, and various other techniques to do that in order to either reseed, or Manamet is doing some work with Winnegant's oyster farm in Georgetown as well, and they have some techniques that we're going to be sharing, methodology and other considerations that town can use as they decide to work on their quahog resource in your town. The milky ribbonworm mitigation was something that was suggested on this last call, and that is something that has been a little tricky because there's not a lot of people working on this. So we were hoping to get a speaker today, and we weren't able to get a speaker, mostly because all the people we contacted who did work on milky ribbonworms, including some local folks at University of New England, are no longer doing that. So we reached out to Canada and someone in Connecticut, and what we have been able to do is compile a basically synthesis of a literature review from some research that's been done, and we'll share that with the group. But unfortunately, there wasn't really anyone actively looking at this, which is just something to think about. because it's obviously a need expressed by communities. Finally, the fourth one is this community shellfish database. And this was something that I think Nate actually brought up, in that, you know, as a committee, if you want to look around and see who else is working on various conservation projects, on a map, where there are closures, what's the contact information for the committees, pairing some of this town developed data from surveys and other projects, and combining it with some of the already available data from the state, from water quality and other GIS layers that they have to create a database. And we've actually submitted 2 grant proposals, because this project was outside of the scope of the working group proper and would require hiring some kind of tech or GIS firm to put this together. So hopefully we will get one of those grant proposals. We should find out in the coming months. And this is a phased approach, where phase 1 will work on a needs assessment to find out what municipalities would find helpful in a database to manage their flats. And the second would be to build out the database with this consulting or IT firm. And the third phase would be populating the database with new municipal information, as well as existing state and other information. And we'd be also working with local nonprofit partners, the working group, and some interns. There's some money in that budget for interns. So those are the updates that I have on the focus group areas. And we don't have any time for questions on those right now, but if you have any, please chat them in the box, and we can get back to you either at the end of the meeting if there's time, or follow up by email. If you're on the distribution list for the working group, then we will send these documents as they're available out on the email and post them on the website. So if you're on this call and you don't already receive the working group emails, just put your email in the chat box, and I believe you can privately put a message to Anne and myself as the host if you don't want to share that for the whole group. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Anne to introduce our speakers and our presentations.
Thanks, Jessica. We have 2 presentations today, and the first is from this wonderful group of students from Bates who have been working with us this semester. And before I start their presentation, I want to introduce them. And as I introduce each one of you, if you can just say hi, so that then you appear and people can see what you look like. And then they'll come back on after the presentation for a Q&A session. So first is Natalie Moon. Say hi, Natalie. Nope, is Natalie not on? Oh, she can't say hi because I've muted her. Sorry.
I unmuted myself just now.
All right, great. Sophia Miller.
Hi. How's everybody?
Sophia. Josie Carter.
Hi.
There they are. All right. So I am going to share the screen and get their presentation ready to go. Just bear with me 1 minute.
And I can just introduce the presentation. They pre-recorded it, so we're going to run through that presentation, and then we'll have some time after that for questions and answers, where we'll unmute anyone who would like to ask a question.
And all right, that's not what I want. Get rid of these. All right, here we go.
So our project is titled Supporting Municipal Co-Management of Shellfish and Community Engagement in Casco Bay. So to offer a little background on our project, every environmental studies major at Bates College completes a capstone course in which they're matched with a community partner and conduct a semester-long project to address an environmental issue or a need in the community. So for our project, Sophia, Josie, and I worked closely with Ann and Jessica to support the Casco Bay Regional Shellfish Working Group. In Maine, the soft shell and quahog clam fisheries are managed through a co-management approach, and this method allows the state's governing bodies, such as the Department of Marine Resources in Maine, to work closely with resource user groups in individual municipalities to regulate fisheries together. Co-management happens on a linear scale, with communication from harvesters to municipalities to the state. However, information sharing between towns happens minimally. So to address this issue, our community partners worked in conjunction with harvesters from the towns surrounding Casco Bay to form the Casco Bay Regional Shellfish Working Group. The goals of the working group include improving communication and collaboration of clam harvesters by sharing information on how to best manage multiple species of shellfish and identifying conservation projects to ensure a sustainable fishery. To accomplish these goals, the working group was interested in understanding the best practices implemented by other states, which is where our project fits in.
Our project aim was to provide resources for successful co-management of multiple species in the Casco Bay fishery to ensure a thriving fishery and healthy marine ecosystem in the future. The objective of our project was to research the best practices of other states to help inform the co-management practices in Casco Bay. Because of COVID-19 related complications, our deliverables shifted around a bit, but in the end, we will be creating a comprehensive inventory of methods being used in 4 states to manage shellfish, specifically clams, resulting in a written summary report. On the East Coast, the main fisheries are for softshell clams, which are pictured on the left, and quahogs, which are pictured on the right.
We wanted to provide you a map of the states that we looked at in our review of best practices. We interviewed key informants and reviewed literature from Washington, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Maryland. A little bit about our methods. The first step that we took was conducting initial background research on the shell fisheries in the 4 states, which again include Massachusetts, Washington, Rhode Island, and Maryland. From there, we identified areas in which we needed additional information and contacted key informants to set up interviews and discuss the shell fishers in their respective states. The second step that we took was coding. For a bit more information, coding is a way of systematically organizing qualitative information when doing an interview with someone. After coding the interview transcripts for each of the 5 categories of interest, which include licensing, reporting, surveying, monitoring, and conservation, we highlighted important information that we identified from each of the categories. A more in-depth representation of how we coded will be examined in the next slide. After coding each interview, we summarized the data into main takeaways. The third step that we took was taking the actual information and writing our final literature review report and taking our summarized main takeaways and elaborating on the areas of particular importance within the final report. The fourth and final step that we took was to create a list of potential ideas moving forward that the Casco Bay area can take away from this report. This was done in collaboration with Ann and Jessica. As mentioned earlier, we would like to discuss a bit more about our interviews and the way we coded each interview transcript. First, we interviewed a total of 9 key informants from all 4 of the states, asking them questions regarding governance, licensing, reporting, surveying, monitoring, and conservation of shellfish resources in each of their respective states. As you can see to the right, we assigned each of the broad categories a different color and highlighted areas that were of importance in each one of those sections. For example, we decided to highlight any important information about conservation practices yellow, which you can see in the small portion of our interview transcripts.
Moving on to the results section, we're going to go through each of the 5 categories that we looked at, and you'll notice that the tables on these slides only include Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maryland, and that's because Washington's shell fisheries are so different from the ones on the East Coast, so we took a more case study approach on that, which Sophia will go into later. So for licensing, we asked key informants from each state about the licensing process in their respective shell fisheries, and we wanted to know if they have multiple licenses for multiple species or more of an all-inclusive master license, and what license holders in both Maryland and Rhode Island hold is a master permit, but they also have to get an endorsement for each species before they can harvest it. In Massachusetts, however, licensing is decided town by town, but most towns do offer an all-inclusive master license for commercial harvesters where species are not differentiated. And we found in our interviews that in the 90s in Barnstable, Massachusetts, they had per species licenses, and they had over 200 licensed harvesters in their fishery. However, they found that this led to severe overfishing of softshell clams. So in 2000, they switched to a master license and came to the sustainable number of 47 commercial licenses. And this reduction in licenses did allow the softshell clams to rebound, restoring their fishery. So currently, Maine's licensing system is most similar to that of Massachusetts, where towns have home rule. And this system works really well because towns can reach a sustainable number of licenses that works for them based on their stock. So an idea moving forward that we had is the working group could discuss using species-specific endorsements similar to Rhode Island and Maryland, but should also be cautious about the number of licenses they offer per species to avoid the risk of overfishing quahogs and softshells. Moving on to reporting, we also asked key informants from each state about their reporting requirements in their shell fisheries, and we wanted to know the frequency they require reporting, who is reporting, and the type of data that is reported. So we created this simplified chart to allow for easier comparison between our findings from each state. And starting with Rhode Island, we found that they use an electronic database titled the Standard Atlantic Fisheries Information System to collect reporting information twice a week. So when harvesters sell to dealers, information on the number of bushels purchased and the location those bushels were harvested in are entered into the database. In Massachusetts, harvesters report the number of bushels harvested annually and dealers report landings. In Maryland, harvesters are required to report the location and date per bushel harvested weekly, and dealers are required to report the location and number of bushels purchased and all total sales monthly. So there's a lot of different requirements for reporting between these three states, but moving forward, we think that the working group may want to discuss what types of reportable data could benefit management and conservation practices. And once the types of data desired are determined, you could discuss the best way to report that data and who should be reporting it, and also how often should data be reported. And recording the location of bushels harvested may also help trace data back to individual towns, which could help towns better manage their resources. However, we do want to recognize that there are pros and cons in increasing reporting measures, as harvesters would have to devote more time and effort to reporting data if you identify harvesters as the most valuable reporters. Moving on to surveying, next we asked key informants about the surveying methods they use in their shell fisheries, and we were seeking to know whether they conduct regular surveys for their shellfish resources on an annual basis, and if so, what methods they use to survey. So we found that in Rhode Island, 2 surveys take place. The first survey is titled Suction Sampling Survey, in which an individual from the DEM randomly places square meter quadrats and uses the suction sampler to excavate everything within the quadrat for various measurements. And the second survey conducted is a dredge survey, in which they tow a small hydraulic dredge about 100 feet, and everything that is brought up in the dredge is measured for abundance, density, and size. And they rotate the sites that those surveys are conducted on an annual basis. In Massachusetts, surveys are conducted by the state's shellfish biologists with the Division of Marine Fisheries and shellfish biologists belonging to each individual municipality. And they conduct surveys on more of a case-by-case basis, typically either prior to a significant dredge or pier project, or if they get a new report of high shellfish numbers in a particular area. And when an area is reported to have increased population numbers, the shellfish biologists in that given municipality will conduct a survey following the protocol set by the state. In Maryland, an annual survey is completed, although some years they do not have the funds or the staff to complete it. But for this survey, when they do have the funds, they tow a hydraulic escalator dredge 250 feet, and everything that the dredge pulls up is collected, measured for size and abundance. So based on what we found in our interviews, other surveys all have set standardized protocols that towns can use for surveying. So the working group may want to continue looking into improving survey techniques and working with the state to determine a standardized protocol to collect better data that can be compared town by town.
Next, we will be discussing monitoring. In our interviews, we asked key informants from each state about monitoring of things such as water quality, biotoxins, and temperature in the ecosystems in their respective shell fisheries. It's important to note that when we refer to monitoring, in this case, we are discussing public health monitoring. We found that in Rhode Island, the Shellfish Monitoring Program exists within the Department of Health, in which individuals are specifically tasked with ensuring that water quality and biotoxins, both in the shellfish meat and water, are kept at a healthy and sustainable level. In Massachusetts, the state's Division of Marine Fisheries is working on getting the water quality sampling done to meet the requirements to keep areas open for harvesting. The state tests for harmful algal blooms, including red tide and biotoxins. Each town also monitors their daily rainfall and closes affected areas for 5 days following 0.3 inches of rain in a 24-hour period to allow shellfish to recover from any pollution events. One example of how monitoring can help harvesters came up in an interview with a shellfish biologist from Massachusetts. He explained that the town of Swansea's clam fishery had been closed for approximately 25 years, and in 2006, the town was looking to reopen their areas. They contacted the state and set up a 2.5-year sampling program where they monitored pollution levels during the different seasons with different amounts of rainfall. When they got the data back, they found that sometimes during rainfall, they had elevated pollution counts, but during dry weather, the area met all of the state's criteria. They found through data collection that after 3 days, the pollution event subsided, and after 5 days the shellfish had successfully depurated. This led the state to reopen the area as conditionally approved based on rainfall. Each state learns to monitor the rainfall, and harvesters could return to areas that had been closed for 25 years. This example shows that increasing monitoring partnerships between towns and states can lead to positive outcomes for harvesters and a reduction in closures. In Maryland, the state water quality unit within the Department of Natural Resources is tasked with ensuring that the shellfish areas are healthy. Based on what we found in our interviews, a question that we have identified includes what monitoring partnerships could be conducted between the municipalities and the state. Although Maine is currently doing this with regards to monitoring rainfall, it is important to identify other areas in which monitoring can be conducted between municipalities and the state. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about conservation. In our interviews, we asked key informants from each state about conservation efforts in their respective shell fisheries. We specifically wanted to know of any conservation projects that were going on to protect their shellfish resources. We found that in Rhode Island, there are currently 2 shellfish conservation projects taking place. The first conservation project is the creation of shellfish management areas, where sanctuaries are formed, which allows the broodstock to remain in place and for more restrictive regulations to be imposed. The second conservation project is the relaying of clams into these designated shellfish management areas. Relaying involves the translocation of quahogs from prohibited areas to areas with cleaner water, giving them about 3 months to depurate as well as to grow. This program allows for increased broodstock and recruitment for future harvest. In Massachusetts, the Division of Marine Fisheries senior shellfish biologist oversees contaminated relays of quahogs throughout the state, relocating quahogs from the Taunton River, and individual municipalities may choose to do these contaminated in-town relays, but on a smaller scale. In Maryland, no conservation projects are currently taking place to ensure the sustainability of clam resources. In all 3 states, there are no conservation project participation requirements in order for harvesters to keep a license, and all participation is voluntary. Because Maine is a leader in conservation practices, we recommend that Maine continues with conservation projects identified in past meetings by harvesters themselves. Additionally, based on our findings, we suggest that an idea could be expanding contaminated relay projects within the state of Maine.
We have decided to look at the shellfish fisheries of Washington state through a slightly different lens because they do not manage the exact same species. They utilize a different type of co-management and differ in fishery size when compared to the East Coast states we just discussed. Nonetheless, we thought that Washington state still had many practices that would be of interest to fishery managers on the East Coast and in Casco Bay. Above is a brief timeline of the history of tribal co-management in Washington state. Prior to the arrival of European settlers, Washington's fisheries were used as a prolific source of food for tribal groups who inhabited the area. In the 1850s, the United States agreed to purchase land from tribal groups in exchange for money and access to the fishery. By the 1960s into the 1970s, a time period referred to as Fish Wars, tribes struggled to have their rights to the fisheries recognized, and tribal members were arrested and jailed for violating the state law. The United States and the treaty tribes sued the state of Washington on the grounds that they had failed to uphold the treaty agreement signed in 1855. By 1974, the Bolt decision ruled in the federal government's favor and guaranteed tribal groups a 50% share of the state's fishery, which was a major victory for tribal groups. The Bolt decision used language that gave the tribal groups access to salmon, but the state of Washington denied tribal groups an equal 50% share of shellfish. The Rafiti decision was made in 1994, giving tribes fishery rights to shellfish. Geoducks are the largest shellfish fishery in Washington. The average geoduck is 2.07 pounds and can live more than 160 years. They are found in soft substrate in both subtidal and intertidal zones. The commercial fishery was first established in 1970. Tribal and state ecosystem managers conduct biological surveys and use a deterministic age structure equilibrium yield model to assess populations. The protocol for biological surveys has to be agreed upon by both sides, and no changes can be made without the other side agreeing. From there, the state and tribal groups split the total allowable catch, or TAC, 50-50. The state sells quotas to dealers in a competitive bid process. The dealers then hire dive teams to fill their quotas. Tribal harvesters collect geoducks for commercial, ceremonial, and subsistence purposes. Monitors enforce regulations at every harvest on both the state side and the tribal side. Both Manila clams and native littleneck clams are biologically similar to quahogs, and they are managed together in Washington state. Manila clams are less than 3 inches, burrow 2 to 6 inches into substrate, and are found in the upper intertidal zone. Native littleneck clams are less than 3.5 inches, burrow 4 to 6 inches into substrate, and are found in the mid-intertidal zone. Native littleneck clams and quahogs are different species in Washington and on the East Coast, so their categorization in this case study is slightly different. Like geoducks, Manila and native littleneck clams are co-managed between the state and tribal groups. Both managers use the same systematic random line transect protocol. Between the state and the tribal groups, about 35 out of the 131 active beaches are surveyed per year to determine biomass. From there, the TAC is split 50-50 between the state and tribes. On the state side, there is no commercial fishery, but there is a very active recreational fishery. Recreational clammers can buy a seaweed and shellfish license for $18 a year. The state reseeds as necessary to maintain the recreational fishery. The tribal groups have a very active commercial fishery, as well as a ceremonial and subsistence fishery. Like the state, tribal groups also reseed beaches that have been heavily harvested. Based off our findings in Washington, our main takeaways include that when survey protocols are shared between co-managers, it's easier to compile and analyze data because all of it is uniform. Active communication between co-managers is important for maintaining a healthy fishery. Pre-season surveying to determine TAC prevents overharvesting, and enforcement of regulations ensures the fishery's long-term health. Here we have a summary of ideas moving forward. Take a moment to look it over, and we are happy to take any questions you might have about our presentation.
Thank you very much, Natalie, Josie, and Sophia. And we'll do the same drill as before in terms of the question and answer, except that I'm not going to call on people. And so let us know via the chat or the raise hand feature if you have a question that you would like to ask the students. And I'll start out by saying that I learned a lot from your work and your presentation, and I thank you for that. I have had gooey duck and can report that it is delicious, but that is one big clam. You all were on the steep learning curve. What jumped out to you? You started learning about Maine first, but when you researched these other states, what did it make you realize about Maine and how we do things here?
I think what stood out to me was definitely the conservation projects and how Maine requires harvesters to participate in conservation projects. And a lot of the 3 states that we looked at, but Maryland, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, they don't require that. And even Maryland, I thought was super interesting because they don't even have any conservation projects at all for clam species. So that's what stood out to me.
Yeah, similarly, I think it was like Washington has a ton of money for surveying, just because the fishery is so large and lucrative. But the conservation projects are a lot less extensive than in Maine, which I didn't really expect. But there is more surveying done on the state level, so it's just different where different states dedicate resources.
I think for me, I did a lot of the interviews with people from Massachusetts, so seeing the similarities between Maine and Massachusetts was really interesting. And particularly, I noticed that Maine seems to involve the towns a lot more than some of the other states with the whole concept of home rule. And I find that really interesting. We mentioned in our presentation some of the positive things about that, allowing towns to take more control over management, but that just seemed really cool. And it was interesting to learn more about that throughout the process.
Thank you for those observations. Anybody have a question or comment that you want to? All right. Max, you are unmuted.
Great job on the presentation. I found it very informative. I just had a question. I don't know if you have this data, but I was wondering how these states that you guys interviewed, how they were doing, how if the species, the clam populations were on an uptrend, were they on a downtrend, how were their practices affecting their population? I don't know if you guys looked into that at all.
So I can speak a little to that a little bit from Massachusetts. I don't have exact numbers, but when we were talking about conservation and surveying with the Shellfish Constable of Barnstable, Massachusetts on Cape Cod, she was saying that things are pretty stable. And I asked about surveying, and she said that they don't need to do it that much because they already know where everything is, and that's not changing. So that's not exactly data, but it seems like things are pretty stable and they don't really feel the need to boost numbers.
Yeah, similarly in Washington, there's so many safeguards in place, and the surveying is so extensive that they know exactly what's there. And from there, they can determine the tax. So there is like safeguards on overfishing. And then if there is, let's say, people taking clams from that don't have licenses, and that they're still checking for it in the beginning of each season. So the population isn't decreasing, it's either going to be stable or increasing, if that makes sense.
I think that's also really interesting because in Maryland, they're surveying, they said they don't really survey for clam species because they don't really have because they move so much, they don't have an idea of where they are. So in contrast to Massachusetts, I don't have data necessarily either, but I think that's just something to keep in mind as well, that they kind of don't do the surveys and don't really know where the clam population is as much as, say, a state like Massachusetts.
Thank you. That was a great question. I think in the interest of staying on schedule, we're going to move on to our next presentation, but thank you so much you all for your hard work on this. And we look forward to the final report. All right, our next speaker is Ivy Frignoka from the Friends of Casco Bay. And she's going to report on her work with the Maine Climate Council, particularly on the Coastal and Marine Working Group of the Maine Climate Council. And I know she'll say this, but this is a great opportunity for shellfish harvesters and people who are interested and care about this industry to have input into what the Climate Council is doing, which can be hard to engage with. So thank you, Ivy, for sharing what you know with us today.
My pleasure. Can you hear me fine? All right. Does this work?
Yep.
Okay, great.
A little soft on my end, a little low.
I'll be more assertive. So, hi everyone. Thanks for sticking through till the end. It's much harder to discuss things over a computer than it is in person, but I hope we can make this as personable as possible. For those of you who I don't know, I work as the Casco Bay Keeper with Friends of Casco Bay, and that means that my primary job is to be the lead advocate for the Bay and to do whatever I can, working with many other people, such as all of you, to improve and protect the health of the Bay. So I'm not here to talk about my specific work, which, like all of you, is impacted a bit by the COVID-19 virus. We're not out on our boat doing water quality monitoring. But about our role with the Climate Council. So, the screen is frozen. Why won't it let me advance the slide?
You're sharing.
There we go.
That's okay, good.
All right, so my talk, I'll give you a little brief overview of some of the work leading up to the Climate Council, and then focus in on the Coastal and Marine Working Group and the draft strategies that we've developed and that I hope you'll provide some feedback on. So prior to Governor Mills' bill to create the Maine Climate Council, there had been other efforts in Maine to address climate change. There was a legislative effort in 2003 that led to a climate action plan the following year to mitigate our emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. And then there was a similar legislative directive that led to a report in 2010 on how we can adapt to climate change. And since then, Maine has had an interagency task force that talks about all of the work that the state is doing to address climate change. Outside of state government, there's also a lot going on, and specific to the marine environment, there was another bill in 2014 to establish a commission to study what we know and didn't know about ocean acidification and to make recommendations. And that commission issued a report to the legislature in 2015. And one of the big recommendations that it made is that an ongoing council be established. And 2015 was not the time for that to happen. So instead, a group of us got together and voluntarily formed a partnership called the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership to share what people were doing to better understand the science in this area and how we might make management decisions. And you probably, if you look at this, will recognize some of the people, two of whom at least are on the call. And that group, since 2016, has been a very effective partnership. Twice a year, we came together and shared our research and what we were doing to address not just ocean and coastal acidification, which is basically that our coastal waters are getting more acidic and less of a good place for particularly shell species like soft shell clams, but also just generally the changes we are seeing, like rising ocean temperatures leading to increased green crabs or other impacts that were negatively impacting our very valuable marine species. And we also used this as sort of a research network as best we could. We had no funding, so no means to sort of collect the data and disseminate it to all of you, like some of the proposals that you're working on as a collaborative. So shortly before Governor Mills was elected, this partnership said, you know, now's really the time. We should be looking at creating a council and building upon the work that this partnership has done. And we met with the Coastal Caucus of the state legislature. Representative Joyce J. McCrate, who's on this call, was part of that. And we all worked together to put forth a bill to create a Marine Advisory Council. Governor Mills' staff took the bones of that bill and wrote it into her Climate Council bill, and also asked if those of us who'd been involved in this voluntary partnership would work together to sort of say, here's what we've done and here's next steps. And we did that last summer and put together an action plan. And the recommendations from that action plan have now been woven into the strategies that I'll review with you in a little while. But what I want to point out here is two things that are important to either you as municipal shellfish managers or as harvesters. One is that it should build upon existing efforts. And another is that it's really important, whatever the state's climate action plan does, that it recognizes the critical role of municipalities, fishermen, and aquaculturists. So that's sort of some of the steps that were going on prior to the LD 1679, which is the bill that created the Climate Council. What's great about the council is rather than a plan for mitigation, a plan for adaptation, and one-time legislation, this bill requires a single action plan that looks at both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how we're going to adapt to climate change. And it creates a permanent ongoing council. So a plan has to be created every 4 years, and every year the state has to provide a report to the legislature that details the actions it's taken to meet that climate action plan. So remember, when we look at the strategies, what's happening right now is we're making recommendations for the first 4 years. What's most important to achieve now that can be built upon later. And then, I don't know about you, but I find a lot of the bureaucratic words kind of wonky and difficult to understand. So mitigation is basically how we're going to reduce or prevent emissions of greenhouse gases. And the 3 bullet points below that, and I'm sorry for those of you who are on the phone, I'll explain this with the next slide, are the targets that the law sets that we have to meet. And what do those targets mean? Again, to translate it, if you look at this slide, which I'll explain for those of you on the phone, there is a level of 1990 emissions, and these are all emissions of any carbon dioxide equivalent. And then the statute sets the amounts below that level that have to be achieved. So if you look at this green line here, that's the amount that we have reduced. This line here is the trajectory, and these dots are what the goals are. So by 2050, we have to be at 80% reduction below greenhouse gas emissions. And there's 2 ways we can achieve that. Either emit less or figure out ways to trap greenhouse gases in manners that are like in trees and plants and stuff that absorb carbon dioxide. And then the part that's really important to us, all of us who make our livings from and care about the coastal and marine environment, is adaptation. And that basically means how we're going to anticipate and adapt to the adverse effects of climate change, and also how we're going to take advantage of the opportunities. So from your perspective, it's things like using the Beal boxes that are pictured here to keep green crabs away from clam spat until they can grow to a size where they can be sustainable. And taking advantage of opportunities might be saying, well, if there's enough black sea bass, can there be a fishery for that? And in the coastal and marine environment, we're such a small slice of the cause of greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's really our road transportation and our energy sources and our buildings where we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're really bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change. So the Coastal and Marine Working Group is very, very focused on adaptation and what do we need to do to adapt to climate change. So for those of you who haven't seen it yet, the Climate Council structure is that there is a council at the top, and there are so many different facets and interests that have to be represented on this Climate Council. So there is literally only one seat for fisheries, and fisheries is defined as including aquaculture. So at the council level, there's one voice for your interests, and that voice goes to Patrice McCarran of Maine Lobstermen's Association. And most of your interests are represented in the Coastal and Marine Working Group, which is the working group that I serve on, and the Community Resilience Group, because that has a public health component, and that's where they're really looking at red tide and other harmful algal blooms that are closing your fisheries and that impact public health. So the bulk of my talk is going to focus on coastal and marine and what we're doing in that working group. So the Coastal and Marine Working Group has 31 members, and people ask me a lot how much of that is fishermen and aquaculturists, and it's a small slice. And that's why it's so important to talk with groups such as yours. And the reason it's a small slice is coastal and marine is everything coastal and marine. It's tourism, it's our working waterfront, it's our ferry services, it's fisheries, it's habitat protection, it's stormwater management. It covers so many topic areas. So the way that and we're supposed to recommend monitoring. So the way that we decided to do our work is we broke into little subgroups and put together our recommendations, which in bureaucratic lingo are called strategies. And we're only allowed as a working group to have 4 to 6 strategies. So the ones I'm going to share with you are really broad buckets, and the detail falls underneath. And that's where I love your feedback, because there's an obvious one that I think is missing from this list, and would like to know what you think, and then what you think regarding the detail that belongs. So our first recommendation, and these are not prioritized yet, so we haven't put them in order. We're meeting tomorrow for that, I hope for that purpose, is to build upon what the MOCA voluntary partnership tried to do and have a statewide mapping, monitoring, and modeling effort. And this isn't just for the sake of data. This is to really build upon everything that is going on already, whether it's your shellfish surveys or the water quality monitoring that we're doing, or research that Bigelow Labs is doing, or Down East Institute is doing, and to have all of that information together. So it's kind of like what you were looking at what you're looking at as resources for your town council or guidance documents. It's kind of like, here's all the science that you would need to make recommendations and take action at a localized level. So that's recommendation number 1, feeling that that was pretty important in the first round of the plan. Then how do you get that information? Recommendation, the next recommendation we're working on is to have an information exchange. And this would be, how do we collect the data? The students did a great job presenting on this so that it's uniform and usable, so you can compare data collected in different areas. And how do we get that out? So this might include portals where you can go and get information. It would include briefings for legislators. It would include workshops for town officials. So this is an idea that is in formation, and again would build upon the models like MOCA and other groups that were working and are working collaboratively throughout Maine in this area. The third, and this is really getting into a lot of the specifics of what you all do, is to establish a Maine Marine Business Council. And this would be broken down by sector, and it would go beyond the scientific monitoring and modeling to really studying economics and being able to make and support business decisions and transitions that need to be made to adapt to climate changes, and also as a forum to get funding to test out pilot projects. So I know you talked about doing some of that through your regional collaborative, and this was an idea to sort of have that supported at a state level. Also, this was a recommendation that came out of the fisheries and aquaculture subgroup. What I haven't seen come out of them yet, and this is one of the things I'd love to hear from you on, is recommendations for a review of how fisheries are currently managed and whether there should be changes to adapt licensing or how fishery species are managed to help us adapt to climate change and help keep our commercial fisheries viable. So the next area of recommendations are to help our waterfront be climate ready. And this would really involve the concept right now is a revolving loan fund, so that municipalities could have funds to adapt their waterfronts for the future, whether it's to address sea level rise, storm surge, different power cords, so you could partly electrify ports, whatever needs to be done. And if you'll notice that all of these recommendations so far are adaptation, because of what I was saying about how we in the coastal and marine environment feel the brunt of the changes versus, further inland. I'm not saying they don't have impacts, but we have a lot. And then this is another sort of one of those wonky bureaucratic titles, climate adaptive planning and management using nature-based solutions. But this basically means let's use what we have. So where we can we put in bigger culverts to restore tidal flow and create better habitat? And in doing that, if we have more marshland again or better flow, we'll have better and healthier fisheries. Can we revise our stormwater laws so that our stormwater, when it flows into our marine environments, is less polluted? So it's a whole, it's everything we can do to help us protect our resources. And then finally, on the mitigation side, how we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Both salt marshes and eelgrass beds, such as that pictured here, are really good at capturing carbon and storing it. And so we think our strongest strategy in the marine environment for helping with mitigation of greenhouse gases is to protect these habitats. And we also think that that has so many benefits for our fisheries and for healthy marine and coastal environments. So this is a strategy with a lot of benefits. And then the question people always ask is, are the meetings open to the public and how do I participate? Well, this is a list of some of the meetings that are in my calendar as a member of the Coastal and Marine Working Group. They're all open to the public. They can get pretty down in the weeds. So in terms of when are the best opportunities or times when you might look to participate, right now is when we are looking to get feedback from people on what do you think of the draft strategies, not just the Coastal Marine Working Group's draft strategies, but from all the working groups. And then we'll take those comments and revise our strategies and get them to the Climate Council in June. That date is highlighted. And then the Climate Council will weave together all the strategies and draft the action plan and go back out in October to get public input on the draft action plan. And then in December, they'll deliver their plan to the governor and the legislature. So to repeat, all meetings are open to the public. Spring is right now is when we're soliciting feedback on the draft strategies, and fall will be on the draft climate action plan. So for those of you who want to go deep in the weeds, the first link takes you to the Climate Council page. The second link takes you to the Google Drive where the Coastal Marine Working Group folders are. It is pretty wonky and detailed. So some of the easiest ways you can give feedback are to ask me questions now. We can capture the chat and I can bring it back to the working group tomorrow. And then also at that Climate Council link, there is a place where you can submit comments, or any member of the public can submit comments. So thank you very much for paying attention, and I look forward to any discussion that you'd like to have about this.
Thank you so much, Ivy. You did a great job of presenting a lot of information in a digestible way. And I think we can send those links out on our to our email list. So if you're not on our email list, put your email in the chat. And I would like to open it up for questions or comments or feedback. Very timely that Ivy she won't even have to write it down. She can remember it until tomorrow. So use your raise hand feature or the chat to let us know if you have something you would like to share or question.
Or if you're on the phone, you can dial #9.
I think it's *9, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I had that written down to say that and forgot already.
That's why there's 2 of us.
I guess I could start by asking a question about the, I mean, you said there are a lot of different coastal and marine interests represented in the group. Has the group talked about the shellfish industry specifically at all?
So the Fisheries and Aquaculture Subcommittee has. And I have been on the ecosystem and monitoring subcommittees. And in our group, we did, in terms of recognizing the importance of the habitats and making sure that we have good environmental and water quality to preserve those fisheries.
All right, that's good to know.
But I guess, I mean, I feel like that's part of what is still remains to be done. I think we still need a little bit more in terms of recommendations for how to adapt in that area.
So that's where you're really looking for input from all of us, for example.
Well, I guess just from anybody that listened to this, do these seem right for big buckets? Was there something glaring that was missing?
Well, you did say you thought there was one that was missing.
Yeah, I thought when the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership held our stakeholder meetings last summer and got input from people all up and down the coast, including Dan, who I see is participating. There was a very vigorous conversation about at the federal level, we can't really control, but with that, looking at what kind of adaptive changes should be made with respect to aquaculture licensing or fisheries management or licensing to help us adapt moving forward, to be able to adjust to the changes that climate change is bringing in the marine environment, even the increased incidence of HABs. That's a huge issue in Casco Bay. So I just wondered if people felt that, you know, if they agreed with what came up, which was really big for us last summer, and is the one recommendation from the stakeholder process we had last summer that I don't see captured yet in coastal and marine.
Interesting. Well, I can report that our both our steering committee meetings and at our work group meetings, the climate change is always part of the conversation, and ocean acidification is an important topic. In fact, we've had a speaker at a previous meeting talk about that. It's something the harvesters are very much aware of, and we have a comment in the chat from Cody about, is this being caused by the Gulf Stream and waves of warm water coming in from the Gulf Stream? So they're interested not just in what's happening in their little bay, but is this you know, how is this a system-wide phenomenon? So I think we can fairly represent the group by saying that looking in detail at these recommendations and making sure they address things from the harvester's perspective.
Yeah, and Ivy, if we don't have any other comments or feedback today, we're happy to keep this conversation going through the working group. We have about 90 people on our distribution list that we'll be continuing to communicate with. So when you get down to those next deadlines and dates, if you have any other documentation that you'd like us to share and try to get feedback on, we can do that over email, at least until we're all able to meet in person again. And then when we circle back in the fall, it looks like at that point, the recommendations will be more formalized. But even if it's just getting word out about the stakeholder meetings, which I imagine will also be virtual, at least in the near future, but we're happy to continue this conversation and help be liaisons with the shellfish community through this group.
Okay, well, I will bring that idea back tomorrow and let the two co-chairs of the Coastal and Marine Working Group know that. And if people even, I think my email was on that last slide and you can share it. If people even want to separately reach out to me by email and share something, I can provide that feedback tomorrow. But this is really a time, I mean, when I look at what you're proposing on a regional scale, it totally fits in. And so I just think if there's any thoughts like, okay, this looks good or means nothing to us, anything at all would be helpful.
Right. Thank you so much, Ivy, for your presentation, but also for really digging in on all of those meetings and sub-meetings to make it possible for those of us who haven't taken the time to do that to be able to have input. So we really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Ivy, if you want to add your email in the chat box, and then I'm actually going to follow up tonight at some point with another email to announce a webinar tomorrow. And given the time sensitivity that your meeting is tomorrow, that if anyone who wasn't on this meeting gets that email, that they know to email you any feedback that could be incorporated into the working group meeting that you have tomorrow morning. I'm not sure that how many we'll get, but I can at least offer to do that as well.
Yeah, and not looking for something detailed, but just just even impressions, just something that I can share with the group. And if there's none, okay.
Okay. So. Well, we'll work on that, and I'll also post your presentation to our webpage so people can view that as they consider their feedback. So great.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to transition the last couple of minutes just to some announcements and next steps that I'm going to try to pull up on my computer. If you bear with me for one moment, but I can start talking as I go. And The first one is that we have heard, and I'm not sure how many harvesters we still have on the line, but that there's been a lot of people who are directly marketing their clams and catch. And there are a few resources out there, one that I emailed and another one that the Gulf of Maine Research Institute had worked on that I'm going to provide a link on shortly. There we go. Can everyone see that screen now? Okay. So the this link just brings you to a resource guide that just talks about different kinds of permits and licenses that you need to direct market if you're not going to just distribute from your home, which is allowed with just your shellfish harvester license. If folks are aware of that, there is a few federal economic assistance available right now to small businesses, as well as self-employed or independent contractor, and that includes shellfish harvesters and fishermen. The primary programs are the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, and those provide loans to anyone who meets the eligibility requirement and can show their records, typically tax documents. And the interesting thing about this is that the loans are forgiven if you can prove that you're using them on eligible expenses. And then they have very low interest rates otherwise, and a 6-month payment deferral. Unemployment is also soon going to be available to self-employed. Currently, on Maine Department of Labor, it's not available yet, and that's because their systems have never been set up to do this before. But in addition to the weekly benefits that Maine provides, there's an additional $600 a week from the Federal CARES Act. So that would mean that there's a maximum of just over $1,000 a week available. And that should be available in the coming weeks through Maine Department of Labor. So if anyone knows a fisherman who can't find anyone to sell to, or I know that the prices are around half of what they typically are for a bushel, that this is an option, and it is retroactive to the start date, which was a month or 2 ago. Finally, if all that was really confusing, you're not alone, and there is a webinar that I've been helping the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association coordinate tomorrow at 4 p.m. And that's the Zoom link, but you can also just go to maincoastfishermenassociation.com and find that event as well. And we'll have experts from the Maine Small Business Development Center, CEI, and Camden National Bank to talk about how to navigate these resources for fishermen. And Maine Coast Fishermen's Association also has other resources available on their website. And I'm just going to close it out with a few next steps for the working group. We will prepare and distribute a meeting summary and post the webinar, which we've recorded online in case anyone has missed it, along with the PowerPoint slides. So you can have these links and resources. I guess we didn't really get a ton of input yet on any shared equipment needs from the towns. That's something that we'll reach out again and ask for, because we do have a budget for that. And I know we're out of time now, so I'm not going to hold anyone up. We did have a few spring and summer site visits and demonstrations in mind for surveying. And I know Manomet's planning a green crab soft shell demo. And I think everything right now is up in the air until we know the timing of when some of the social distancing guidelines are released. But we'll be in touch by email over those. And then this was all part of the regular plan that we wouldn't be holding meetings during the peak season, late spring into early fall of the shellfish fishery. So we were planning anyway to continue meetings in the fall. And in the interim, we'll continue working on those 4 working group focus areas that I reviewed earlier. So that's all I have. And Anne, feel free to chime in if I forgot anything else, but I think that that covers the content that we were hoping to today. And I appreciate everyone joining webinar, and I wish and hope next time we can all see you in person.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.